Thank you for joining our event today. My name is Bruce Eaton, and I want to welcome all of you to our Medical Device Resource Group webinar today. I have the pleasure to be moderating the discussion today on behalf of MDRG, which, for those of you not familiar with the organization, is an association of 16 unique companies, all who play a very distinct role in helping manufacturers bring medical devices of all types from the concept stage all the way through the mature market lifecycle stage. If you'd like to learn more, please visit mdrg.org. I'd like to mention that there will be an opportunity for you to submit written questions. If you look on the right side of your screen at the toolbar, you can write your questions right there if you've got any. And we'll allow some time to answer these, as many as we can, before our time is up today. We'll also be doing 2 short polls during our discussion and sharing the responses during our time today, which should be interesting. So as a partner in the Minneapolis-based brand marketing firm E10, I've had the privilege to work on hundreds of medical device introductions over the past 40 years. I've never lost my sense of awe at the technological challenges and the manufacturing complexities that the industry hurdles every day. Now companies must face the added reality of a global pandemic, which has forced manufacturing and supplier slowdowns, combined with the closure of international borders. It certainly seems an understatement to say the device industry is truly facing unprecedented disruption. Thus, the title of today's discussion, Current Realities Reshaping Global Supply Chains for U.S. Medical Device Companies. So to help us discuss this issue today, we're privileged to have former Congressman Erik Paulsen with us. Erik represented Minneapolis' Minnesota's 3rd Congressional District from 2009 to 2019. As a member of the Chief Tax Writing House Ways and Means Committee, Erik helped enact major initiatives in healthcare, economic, and trade policy, including the permanent repeal of the medical device tax. And I'm going to reiterate, permanent is there, which is just wonderful. So we're really happy about that. As well as Erik was also the chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, focusing on innovation, entrepreneurship, access to capital, digital trade, key economic issues, while working with the President's Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Board. Erik has also served as co-chair of the House Medical Technology Caucus and was the premier leader and advocate of the medical technology industry and the life-saving technologies it provides to patients and the hundreds of thousands of jobs it supports. Erik is currently the chairman of the Institute of Gene Therapies and is sitting board member of both Cardiovascular Systems, Inc. and Pediatric Home Service. Erik, it's truly an honor to have you with us today and to discuss what some of the latest thinking is related to alleviating some of the tensions surrounding the supply chain issues and what is being done in Washington, D.C. related to supporting domestic manufacturing. So as a starting point, Erik, do you want to just provide a short recap of your time in Washington and maybe share some of your perspectives on what is key to keeping the U.S. medical device industry strong?
Great. Well, first of all, Bruce, thanks for hosting our virtual event. It's too bad we can't be live for a lunch event of some sort, but it's wonderful to be with MDRG. And I want to thank all of you as well for the work you do and being a part of your own supply chain and helping keep this industry so strong, not only in Minnesota, but around the country. It's a great American success story. You know, it's true that promoting these made in America medical devices and I guess encouraging innovation is really near and dear to my heart during my entire tenure in Congress. I often joke that when someone would ask me, you know, Erik, why would you go to Washington? I didn't say it was to escape the Minnesota winters, but it was that I wanted to make a difference on a few things. And one of the ways for me to do the most for my constituency, because we have such a med tech concentration in Minnesota, and also help the country was to really foster the health of this very strategic industry. And you all know, I think the U.S. has led global medical device industry for decades. It's leadership that has brought hundreds of thousands of jobs, high-paying jobs actually to our country, and the life-saving and life-improving devices to our nation's patients, which is what it really is about. And by the way, these are good, rewarding jobs. They pay higher than average salaries. As you mentioned, as co-chair of the Medical Technology Caucus, I always enjoyed and appreciated the opportunity to meet with some of the best and brightest innovators in the country. I got to travel outside of Minnesota, to Florida and Massachusetts and California and other areas where there was a concentration. But Minnesota was still top, and Minnesota is obviously host to some of the big titans that we all know. It could be a Medtronic or some other companies. In my district alone, I remember there were 200 plus medical device companies. So nearly every week I had an opportunity to tour and visit a small company that might have 5 employees or 10 employees. They were not profitable yet, but there was usually always a doctor or an engineer or an entrepreneur that had come up with some idea in the garage or was trying to help improve or save lives. And I think what really excited me also is that 80% of all med tech companies are small businesses, employing 50 people or less. And it's also a net export for our country. So it's one of the real positives that we should be talking about from that American success story. It's not just a bunch of white lab coats in a lab trying to find a better and faster way to make a widget. And so it's true, I did become sort of a premier leader and recognized leader for MedTech on a bipartisan basis, I will add, advocating first for some FDA reforms that have been implemented over time. And then also that repeal of the medical device tax, which you mentioned, a crazy idea that you'd have an excise tax put on revenue, not on your sales and not on profits, and adding another hurdle for companies to become profitable in the first place, which presented some real challenges and unfortunately some lost jobs and cutbacks in R&D. And it's true, we were able to suspend the tax several times. Often we'd have great votes in the House on a bipartisan vote. We couldn't quite get the Senate over the hump. And like anything else in Washington, it takes persistence and time. And after 10 years, it finally became permanent. And hopefully that's behind us in the rearview mirror. We won't have to worry about it anymore. But ultimately, like any other issue, building up a coalition of support is how you meet some success. So it's one of my proud accomplishments. I still stay in touch regularly with my stakeholder friends in Washington and former colleagues on that issue, and they still call with advice, asking for advice on those issues too as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an excellent overview. And so in order to just start our first question here, I'm going to just see if I can, here we go. The first question that I'd like to ask you as we go into this, related to this topic, in your estimation, how significant is the medical device supply chain disruption issue now in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, this is a really good topic, I think, for your members or for others in this industry, in the realm of healthcare, to be talking about or thinking about. And I think when we talk about the supply chain, you have to put it a little bit in this perspective. The United States is the global leader in the development and the production of these innovative and life-saving medical technologies. We manufacture the majority of all of the world's medical technologies. It happens right here in the United States. And we're not only the global leader in exports, but we supply 70% of all of the domestic market for medical devices. So I think Europe provides about 15%. But you even compare that to China, and Chinese imports to the United States only account for about 3% of the devices used domestically here in the United States. And overwhelmingly, those are devices or products that are comprised of low-cost commodity type products for the most part. So you've got 7,000 registered companies right now with the FDA, which is the oversight agency that has primary oversight. You've got an industry, I think, that has really significant redundancy built into it. We have, multiple companies that are manufacturing competing products in many cases. And so we've got increased competition. We've got resiliency, I think, in our supply chain. If even a single device manufacturer encounters a shortage, it's likely you're probably going to see several competitors that are ready, willing, and able to jump into the fray and provide that product. So the marketplace, I think, for medical device components is also very diverse because you've got thousands of companies that are competing across lots of different product lines. I mean, you take the case of a ventilator that has, 1,500 pieces or, a variety of pieces that go into producing that one product. you've got a lot of different sourcing, a lot of different components of the supply chain, but also probably a lot of competitive opportunities to fill in the gap if there were some, to keep resiliency going if there were some gaps. When device companies manufacture outside the United States, it's primarily only due because we're serving some sort of global market. And that's important to keep in mind that 95% of the world's consumers do live outside the United States. And so there is going to be a presence for some of our companies in other countries for that purpose. But the pandemic has really probably brought a lot more increased attention, a lot more scrutiny and concern on these supply chain issues because of a stronger unprecedented demand we've seen for goods, strained supplies, medical supplies like ventilators, PPE. And so it's forced Congress now and policymakers to really look at supply issues regarding our preparedness and to address sort of, what could be a resurgence, for instance, this fall of COVID, as well as being able to potentially quickly deploy a vaccine, because that's going to take a lot of resources. And I think the medical device community could play a strong role and will play a strong role in that deployment as well. So I think, in sort of the wrapping up some of the thoughts around that question, specifically, there are concerns about the resiliency of the domestic medical supply chain, but it's mostly centered around pharma or accessibility to drugs on that availability. There is an interest, I will say though, by policymakers to reshore production of key supplies and components from foreign countries like China, or those that may not have always been on our friendlier terms. And so medical device companies are partly swept up into that conversation. And I think the key is to make sure there's not a knee-jerk reaction that paints everything with a broad brush, but we look at the supply chain differently for maybe pharma, medical devices, and continue to make progress in reshoring some of those supply chains, but not doing where it's going to be overly burdensome or in the end result in a lack of access for care for some of our patients, because there are some dangers there when Congress can overstep, as we know, or policy is made to paint things with a one broad brush.
Excellent. That's a great overview. Good to hear. As an opportunity for our audience to engage a little bit, what we like to do is do a poll real quickly. And this poll we'll put up on your screen. You'll be able to see it. Has your company experienced any supply chain disruption over the past 6 months related to COVID-19 crisis? And I realize there are some of you out there not related directly to a device company, but might be a supplier to a device company. And I'd like you to answer from the standpoint of if you know of a company that you're working with that has had supply chain disruptions. Maybe you've been part of that, but even as a supplier to the device community, can you answer this question in the 4 categories? And we'll take maybe 30, 40 seconds here for everybody to get their answer linked in, and then we'll have an answer for everybody just to find out how prevalent this disruption is to everybody here on this call. So take a minute and fill that out, and then I think Chris will report the answers. We'll see how that's going. And there it is. So vast majority of people have seen a 76%, only 3% saying no, maybe 7%, and then there's 14 that just aren't quite sure and don't know if that's a pretty good indicator that majority of people on the call have experienced some sort of disruption. Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to go back to my screen here. There it is. All right, so we'll get to the question number 2, Eric. As you think about this issue, who monitors and provides oversight of the medical device manufacturing supply chain in the U.S.?
Well, this is probably something that came to light in relationship to the pandemic. I mean, obviously you have a number of different government agencies as well as Congress that have been weighing in lately. Certainly the FDA has oversight given their jurisdiction for registration and all the work they do with clinical trials and being the primary agency that sets the gold standard for approval of devices. So there's certainly oversight there, and we could talk a little bit about some of the areas where they're tracking some things right now. The U.S. Department of Commerce, I know, and I've seen some articles where they're looking at this issue and possibly maybe making recommendations on policies. It could be related to trade or export or import restrictions, and that's some of their oversight component. Congress has already had several hearings recently, oriented mostly around the pandemic, but also touching on supply chain issues. You have a number of different bills that have been introduced by various members of both parties, addressing studies and also wanting to be a little bit more aggressive on reshoring some of these supplies. So Congress could implement some additional policies or requirements or mandates on agencies. Of course, even FEMA is involved, just as they monitor the strategic national stockpile and some of those issues that we heard a lot about in the ventilator time frame when that was at the peak of the pandemic earlier. And even the coronavirus task force, I would say that hasn't been visible, obviously, in the news so much lately, but you've got a number of folks that serve on that task force that come from various agencies that could make recommendations to the administration for executive orders, or could implement some other studies of their own or recommendations to Congress to follow up legislatively, or propose additional rules that could be having to be followed. So one other thing to watch for, I think, is the administration in particular, is that the trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is always kind of lurking in the background and threatening to issue executive orders about Buy America Only provisions. And he comes from that viewpoint. I don't necessarily come from that viewpoint, but it's something to be aware of. So the administration is a little bit unpredictable as it relates to Buy America provisions. It connects to the China component, obviously, which we've been hearing more about. So that's another area to watch and pay attention to.
Pretty good. So my question number 3, Erik, is what is currently being done to review medical device manufacturing in the U.S.? It's a little tangential to that last question. As we look to review it, what are some of the things you're hearing about it, and who's doing that?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, the FDA certainly has a significant role, and in fact is part of the CARES Act. And the CARES Act was one of the initial COVID response bills passed by Congress, overwhelmingly bipartisanly supported. It involved a lot of dollars and resources that flowed to states and different agencies. But there was a provision that was also included in there that was signed into law back in March 27th, I think. There's a section that was added to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, where it does require now the FDA to maintain a public list of medical devices that are expected to be in shortage or short supply during a public health emergency. And technically, we're in the public health emergency right now. I guess we stay in that emergency until sometime in October is the time frame, but that could be renewed. And so now the FDA is requiring manufacturers right now currently of medical devices, of certain medical device companies, to report if there's a discontinuance in products they are producing, if there are shortages of devices that are expected, and why those shortages may be occurring. Is it related to the pandemic? Is it related to a supply chain component? But again, this applies really only in the context of being in a public health emergency right now. Initially, the FDA, it's important, I think, to point out, wanted to require device manufacturers to even alert them if there was going to expected to be a shortage within 6 months. That ultimately didn't pass or become law. It would require a ton of paperwork, an additional burden for a lot of device companies. So it's something to watch for, where those ideas can get additionally proposed. Another provision also that was included in the law that was passed is that the bill also directs the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to conduct a separate study of the medical product supply chain in our security. And so what is our reliance on certain components that go into devices, where would those shortages be expected to come from, just knowing where our liabilities are at more or less, and being aware of how to address that. So that study is going on right now. I don't know what the time frame is, but they will certainly report back to Congress, or Congress could supersede them and just move ahead with some of their own ideas, because I mentioned earlier there's congressional oversight hearings that have been done. In particular, Senator Lamar Alexander, he's the chairman from Tennessee of the Senate Health Committee, and Senator Alexander held a hearing on responding to the next pandemic. And as a part of that hearing, he issued his own white paper, and it's a pretty lengthy white paper that includes a lot of discussions centering around, how do you restructure the strategic national stockpile, with some different ideas, and actually asking for requests for input. So requests for input means different stakeholders, and they could be medical device associations, it could be MDRG, where you can provide your own written comment to the chairman, because they're expected to come forward with some policy proposals potentially in the next COVID bill, which could be coming up before August. FEMA, which is the emergency agency that provides resources during hurricanes and those natural disasters, is also engaged obviously with the supply of our strategic stockpile, and they're trying to review how they manage that stockpile, making sure that old materials are expelled but new materials are coming in. And so I think one of the concerns that medical device manufacturers have is that there's certainly a strong interest in having a robust and resilient strategic national stockpile, but the private sector shouldn't be required to hold large stockpiles themselves, because that's going to recreate unnecessary inventory costs or space constraints. So the bottom line is the details matter when these types of policy ideas, they may sound good because you want to be prepared, but who carries that burden, where the expense is, does make a difference. And so it's something to be paying attention to. I should mention just a couple other quick points. The next COVID response bill from Congress, as I said, is expected prior to August, before the recess, and Congress always goes on recess in August. That could get delayed. Those types of deadlines tend to spur momentum for some sort of action, but they could go a little bit into August. There's certain, I would say, in all likelihood, to be some sort of supply chain provisions that are included in that larger package. It's either going to be centered around some sort of status quo where they continue to extend the provisions that are in place right now. It could go a very strong populist route, but I doubt it, that is Buy America only, or there's more Buy America provisions. Or third, it could recognize, and I would hope this is the case, that the global supply chain exists, but there are key areas where we don't want reliance, for instance, and could be with China or other unfriendly countries. Again, most of that is on the pharma side and dealing with China and India, or even vaccine sources, for instance, of supplies from China. So again, the device side is very different. There are distinctions, and hopefully that will be recognized as that next package comes together. It does seem to me that both the Democrats and Republicans, for the most part, are looking at more of a carrot versus a stick approach, which is good, and it could be incentivizing reshoring of supply chains through tax credits or liquidity options with different incentives, which is the appropriate way to go, as opposed to just mandating something and expecting it to happen. And then for those located in China right now, can you source that somewhere else? Can you go through Vietnam? Can you go through another country? So it's something I know a lot of companies are looking at, and certainly something I think that could be recommended in the next package. It's also worth pointing out that the House has already passed a COVID response bill as sort of their marker, their starting point. It's called the HEROES Act. Now, it's a multi-trillion-dollar bill that includes a lot of controversial provisions because it was passed not bipartisanly, but pretty much on a partisan vote. And so there are a lot of controversial provisions in there, and they have to reconcile that with the Senate for the final package. But the good news is there's really nothing objectionable, from what I understand, in that HEROES Act related to supply chain issues for medical device companies. And so that's the good news there. So I would also watch for additional executive orders that could come out relating to low interest loans or grants to produce more here domestically, or variations of the Defense Production Act that that can be implemented that force companies to do things at home. There could be variations of that to try and get more investment here in the United States. So again, the challenge is really avoiding knee-jerk reactions and being smart and strategic about it. But Both parties have their populist components. As I mentioned earlier, the Republicans in the administration have Peter Navarro on the trade side that wants to do Buy America only. You've got Senator Josh Hawley, who's a new freshman senator from Missouri, who's been very aggressive on a populist streak, wanting to quickly reshore everything. But I think for the most part, it's fairly bipartisan, recognizing that incentive operations are the way to go to make progress on this issue.
Good. That's a great recap. It's good to hear. My fourth question is very similar to that, with a little bit more depth related to that. This pandemic has certainly shown a vulnerability related to our dependence on China for medical device supplies. What efforts, in a little bit more detail by the U.S. government, are you aware of that are being taken to decouple or minimize our dependence on China?
Yeah, a lot of this focuses on trade, and it's interesting, the biggest challenge on the trade front is China. I mean, it's front and center, with intellectual property theft, et cetera, that we've had some real challenges with over time. And of course, the president loves to talk about tariffs, and we've got a China phase 1 deal that's in place right now that gave some relief to some of those tariffs, but there's still some in place. I would say that both parties, over time, Republicans and Democrats, have kind of moved from a state of, how do we level the playing field with China so we can be competitive with them, with their low-cost structure. They're a growing economy, a lot of people. But we've moved from that, how do we level the playing field, to more of a, how do we decouple with China? How do we decouple ourselves so we're not connected with them? And that's new. That is something brand new on the policy front, but it's new that both Republicans and Democrats are actually speaking in that same language. It's true with China that we have trade disputes. We've had limiting information coming from them about the virus and the sources, and we've even had social media hacks that have tried to discredit the United States. And so when those things are going on, it creates a lot of other tension, and it can get played out over social media to results in other policies. And so it's kind of really difficult to say how this is really going to manifest itself. I know the House Republicans in the House have formed a separate China task force project. And that's important because it's new in the context of it is specifically examining and focusing on a number of issues involving China that include, China not living up to its obligations under the current trade agreements that are in phase 1, or, technology disputes over Huawei or access to 5G, or, Hong Kong, what's going on there recently with some of their democracy challenges and the new laws that have been put into place. You've got the World Trade Organization that has been disrupted. And I think the administration, rightfully so, has been frustrated at slow progress, or if there's a case brought, it takes years often to get through the WTO. So you have WTO issues. And then you've got other side foreign affairs policy issues going on, like China aggression in the South China Sea, for instance, and that supply chain vulnerability component. So there's likely to be a dramatic change on this front. It's interesting that other countries in the wake of the pandemic are also potentially signaling that they're moving in this direction as well from a more populist perspective. They want to make sure they've got their own supplies at home, that they want to maybe decouple from China and not be reliant on countries that have been providing certain medicines, for instance, and it could be generic medicine to needed medicines. And so as the vaccine comes into place, I mean, I'm more of a realist that thinks, global conversation is good. And so you've got to keep those global connections. But the reality is that a lot of countries are starting to put themselves in more of a protectionist mode and a wall around themselves, saying we've got to have X, Y, and Z, and that's top priority. So that's going to present some challenges moving forward. And with China in particular, they're going to be front and center. And I think it's reasonable to see we're going to have steady focus on that decoupling component. I will tell you that I have some worries on the trade front. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of plays out.
No, that's really good to hear, and it's a good overview. It somewhat moves as well into my next question. Being that this is an election year, do you see either party having different approaches to dealing with our supply issues? And as we look to what might happen, would there be anything from your point of view that would alleviate that things will change dramatically, or what do you see just on a party by party review on this issue?
Yeah, the saying is every time you get an election year, you end up in that silly season and crazy things and crazy ideas start happening. And, it's hard to say what's going to happen with less than 5 months to go, how this all plays out with the election itself, in terms of decisions being made within that 5-month period. But clearly, the president is making China a central issue. He's doing that on the political front. He had that press conference yesterday where he's focusing a lot of attention on China and all of his messaging and how he ties that, to his opponent, right, to Vice President Biden. So that is going to continue and be upfront. I think we've seen reasonably steady focus, as I mentioned earlier, on that decoupling component. How do you decouple from China from both parties? That's not likely to change in the near future. I will tell you my worries or concerns on the trade front in general is that I've never been a believer that tariffs are an effective way to address trade disputes. Tariffs are essentially taxes. It's not China paying them, it's a company or it's a customer that's ultimately paying for that. And so simply focusing on tariffs or import quotas and other traditional barriers to trade is no longer enough. I really think we should be seeking more of these 21st century solutions that help streamline trade, that end non-tariff barriers and keep IP protections strong. And then regulations that are impeding the flow of goods and services, behind the border. That's kind of what's going on. And so I just believe we should be advocating for a more robust trade agenda. Again, 95% of the consumers live outside the United States. So I'm a little disappointed that there aren't more Republicans that are advocating for that key bedrock principle of open and aggressive free trade. But the president's kind of commanding, the direction right now, unfortunately. And so I just believe if we're not moving forward on trade, we're going to end up falling behind because other countries have been negotiating different arrangements and deals. And so global competitiveness is not optional. It's sort of mission critical in the end. And I remember back when I was in Congress, South Korea was the first trade agreement that did include specific provisions addressing medical technology and medtech. And we haven't done much since in that space. And so I'd like to see more momentum. I think there's certainly an opportunity to do that since the USMCA was signed. That's NAFTA 2.0. Just at the beginning of July, it was started against new implementation, and it was outdated. And so we've got new, really good provisions in that agreement that could replicate or be the gold standard for future agreements. So that's the good news. It's just hard to get in the election year. It's hard to get beyond some of the politics around China or some of these other issues that may draw the attention. But again, 5 months will come and go, and we'll I think have a more realistic approach immediately after.
No, that's a very good overview. That's good to hear. So we're going to go to our second poll question, everybody. So if you, Chris will pull this up, and the question is, have you or are you planning to make any changes to your outside U.S. supply chain based on the past 6 months? So we have a yes, maybe, no, don't know. If you could take, we'll probably do 30 seconds here to fill those out, and we'll get a reply just to see what the people on our call today are thinking about and if this has been a change. I know I looked at a Gartner report that came out this morning actually on what's happening to the supply chain, and many companies they were indicating were they found we've always done business this way. So change is hard for this, particularly in this industry, certainly with the regulatory and the quality restrictions. Maintaining standards is difficult. So as you change suppliers, how do we keep up with that? So this is one of those points now where how willing are device companies to begin to look at bringing their outside supply chain inside. So here we have a little bit more split results. Yes, there are some people making changes, but it's lower than maybe. So 31 people still looking at this. and no, a definitive no, and then 27 still in that. So we've got many people just kind of in that in-between stage looking at this, whether or not outside supply chain is going to be necessary, whether borders are going to open up or not. So that's very good, very interesting to see. Thanks, Chris. Let's see if I can get back to my screen here. Okay. So then following up on that, Eric, on my view, I'm going to try and get back to my original deck here. Bear with me for 1 second. I'll try and get to that. There we go. So question number 6 really deals with this idea. Do you have suggestions for device manufacturers to keep in mind or put into place as they consider their supply chain disruptions? What are some things that you think companies here in Minnesota, maybe in the US, should be considering as they look at their supply chain?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and just from the results of the last poll, it's pretty clear that there's a little bit of uncertainty. Some are looking at moving supply chains, some don't know, and some are saying maybe. So the challenge with uncertainty is that it paralyzes investment and decision making, and you don't want to see that happen in such an important industry. Whether it's healthcare or jobs connected is a big part of our economy. So that's of concern. I would say first and foremost, it's really important that in this type of a pandemic crisis, you've got to have those in the medical device industry working really closely with their customers, their patients, regulators, and other public organizations, for the sake of public health, but also just doing a lot of communication. And so some members of MDRG may belong to, AdvaMed or the Manufacturers Device Association or Medical Alley in Minnesota. It's just really important to share some data with them because, in essence, those organizations do provide written comment or feedback to policymakers, and so the data does make a difference. And so the feedback is really important to provide. So don't just hunker down and be in the basement, but actually, provide as much information as you can to get as much information as you can, hopefully, in making a smart decision. I think also companies are going to have to focus on how they can make the most effective contributions themselves to help control, spreading COVID or the virus, and keeping their employees safe during these times. So, you're not seeing a rush to send people back to work until companies, the leadership at companies have diligent plans in place to protect their employees, whether it's masks or protocols put in place, which is smart because that just assures you're going to have a good streamlined entry into your business and you'll be able to maintain it successfully with less risk. In the end, with all of these changes that are going on these days, it's really important to stick closely to some of the guidance or regulatory guidance that might come out. Listen to science, listen to the healthcare experts to ensure that, doing things too fast is not going to hurt quality or destroy quality, because you don't want to create even more problems down the road if you've got poor quality. So no matter what, I do think that it's medical device professionals and sort of that entrepreneur component that they have, spirit, is going to help really be an essential role in playing a role in fighting COVID and being successful in the end. And so you're seeing an unprecedented time of more government resources flowing into these areas, which can be good. But in the end, it's the private sector that is going to come up with the solution, that is going to be able to implement a vaccine, that is going to be able to continue to produce great life-improving and life-saving technologies. And so providing as much information and data and working together and staying closely collaborating with communication, I think is important.
Excellent. No, that's a great overview. Well, we'd like to open this up to our next section, which is just questions for the group. And the opportunity just to write a question for Erik would be just in your box over there where you see the questions. And I'm going to have to ask Chris if he sees questions, if he could read them or let me know if there are questions coming in.
Yes, it looks like we've got one or two coming in here. First question is, Erik, do you expect increasing trade barriers to have an impact on our industry? And where do you see the biggest risks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do think you have to be wary of increased tariffs, putting additional barriers in place. And I say that from the perspective of when tariffs are put in place, and we saw this over the last couple of years, they were done with a broad brush. A lot of medical device components and companies were rolled in there. There was some relief given, I think, even as a part of the pandemic, where they pulled back for a temporary period of time. But again, it goes to, I think the reality that the administration is pursuing, they pursue it from the attitude of, if we put tariffs on China, China is the one who's paying for it. And so I think it's broader than that. It's not taking into account the fact that a lot of American companies have to source certain products from different areas around the globe. And if you don't have those components coming in, you can't produce your device or your product efficiently and effectively or at a lower cost. And so ultimately, I think it's a concern. Where the most risk is, it's really hard to say, other than I would say the most risk right now is primarily located within the pharma component of supply chain that are tied to maybe China or India, which also has not had a good record of protecting intellectual property, for instance. And so even generic medicines that have had large production in some of those countries, there's a frustration by folks saying, hey, what if we're short of Advil or simple medications like that when we should be producing or sourcing that from somewhere else? So, the good news is, or I think the opportunity is that the United States works with other countries to do it in collaboration, with, our Atlantic friends, North Atlantic friends, for instance, or others, or building off of existing trade relationships, because there are some positive things happening with Great Britain for future trade agreement, as well as Kenya. First time we've had that in Africa. And so you've got some other opportunities, but the risk are tariffs, because tariffs can be put on by the administration quickly. They can inflict a lot of pain and create other challenges, and that's what we've seen play out. And they don't often get rolled back because it's tough to have certain exclusions. You have to apply for an exclusion. It can take a long time. And so that's why I think we should, I would prefer that policymakers just keep working as much as possible to, lowering barriers as opposed to putting new barriers up.
Great. Here's another one that came in. Do you expect the U.S. government to take a more active role in securing medical device component supply in cooperation with the industry, like you see in other places such as Europe, Japan, and South Korea?
At least right now, I see some cooperation or the opportunity for the medical device industry to be working in sync with other countries. And I primarily say that from the perspective of knowing that even the HEROES Act, which passed in the House, again, has some controversial provisions in it because it's a large, huge, multi-trillion-dollar bill that was done on a partisan vote. None of the supply chain issues, from what I understand, that are in there are controversial. The medical device industry has been supportive of them. And so that's a good sign. That's a good sign. So hopefully some of the studies that come back from, it was the National Academic, the science study that's being done, for instance, when that comes back, hopefully there'll be some positive or some meaningful opportunities to make some implementations and, wait for the study to come back, wait for the data, and then move forward, as opposed to just knee-jerk doing something ahead of time, for instance.
All right, another follow-up question. What about future export prospects to Hong Kong in view of State Department signaling possible suspension of special trading status? Is this just posturing or a serious concern for medtech exporters?
Well, I think it very well could be a serious concern for medtech exporters. What's happened with Hong Kong and some of the statements that have been sent out from the leaders of the foreign affairs committees in both the Senate and the House have been supportive of really objecting to the Communist Party's new moves in Hong Kong, because it goes against everything that was done in the previous agreements. It's kind of moving Hong Kong into the category of oversight directly from the Chinese government. And so I think it will have a longer term, there'll be longer term repercussions, for instance, that spill out of that. And you're seeing a little bit of that. Again, this gets into foreign policy, so it's kind of hard to say what the next administration or current administration would do after the election along this front. But the United States has formally objected to the Chinese in the South China Sea, saying that they own certain islands, for instance, that were owned by the Philippines or other countries, and China has built up military bases or platforms on those islands, and they're claiming jurisdiction to expand their waterways within the China Sea. And the United States has formally objected to that for the first time. So a lot of this gets related to Hong Kong and what's going on there. Whereas if Hong Kong was making progress, or if it was on the back burner and there wasn't as much tension and the democracy protests weren't going on, I don't think you'd see as much tension in this other area in foreign policy even. But it signals to me that it could be a little bit of a rough ride with the economics of Hong Kong, or suppression of the economy in Hong Kong, at least in the near term.
All right, couple more questions have come in here. Has presidential candidate Joe Biden mentioned he wants to remove, increase, or keep the same tariff levels?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the vice president has said, other than I think China has become sort of this political wedge issue, and I don't think on a national stage or a national platform you're going to see either the president or Vice President Biden be viewed as capitulating to the Chinese. And so I think, if anything, Biden, if he's not silent, he's going to say that he's going to be tough against the Chinese, because again, that's sort of a gut political level. It seems that's the direction that is the rhetoric that's been going on a national stage. Again, hopefully some of the policymakers will be able to sort of decipher or move between some of those policymakers in Congress will be able to decipher, move between some of the nuance, some of that that's going on. But I think for the next 5 months, it'll be more rhetoric as opposed to actual actions. And then the question is sort of if there's change, or what change happens right after the election. So that's where the uncertainty is. But I think for the next 5 months, it's going to be a lot of heated rhetoric. The Chinese are likely to just have a wait and see attitude to see who they're going to have to deal with, which kind of happens always in an election year, where everyone who's involved with the current administration just takes a little bit of a pause and says, well, we want to know who we're going to be dealing with next. Is it going to be the same group? Is it going to be a new group of folks? So I don't think you're going to see the vice president making a dramatic shift right now from where we are currently, even if he does support removing some of those tariffs.
All right, I think we got time for one more or two more here. China and the US seem to be on a path to separate their economies and involvement with each other in a number of industries like technology and finance. Do you see the same separation for medical industries? And if so, what is the risk of that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the risk is there that we see the separation, particularly as it relates to the pandemic, in the construct of, the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization. Whether you agree with that or not, the fact that we withdrawn, or at least have withdrawn for now, signals a little bit more tension around China in the healthcare space. And I think a lot of medical device companies look at China for, not resourcing product necessarily or supply chain, but customers. And so you've got a huge amount of customers in China that are with a growing middle class, just like in India or other countries in developing countries, democracies like India, for instance, where you want those countries to be purchasing healthcare products or medical devices to improve lives. And the Chinese are going to have an interest in that. So that's the opportunity. The challenge is protecting your intellectual property, making sure that things are sourced appropriately within supply chains, and there's a resilient supply chain. And so that's the challenge, is how do you do that in construct with hopefully your allies at the same time moving forward. But I think there's risk, just given the fact that we withdrew from the World Health Organization, for instance, more on the healthcare side than there probably would have been previously.
Great. It looks like that's all the questions we have at this point.
Good. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Eric. For those of you on the call, just a quick note that we will hope to have a recording of this discussion posted on the MDRG website blog area. So if you'd like to direct others in your organization to listen in on today's discussion, look for it there in the next few days. Hope to get it up. And then I just want to give a special thanks to Eric today for sharing your unique ability to bring perspective on this issue, and your dedication to the industry is just tremendous, and we really do appreciate your time and your thought today. I also want to thank Chris Murphy at DDL, who provided the support for our technology today. And we hope to be doing a few more of these webinars, so stay tuned, keep a lookout for those. And thank you to all of you who've joined our presentation today. So we wish you a good day and be well. Bye.
Thank you.